All right, you are all set, Dr. Reiff. You are
Hey,
live.
good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for taking the time to participate on another session of Lupus LA. Today's topic will be on clinical trials. My name is Andreas Reiff. I am the current Senior Vice President for Immunology and Inflammation at a company called Parexel, which is a company that conducts clinical trials worldwide. I joined that company about 4 years ago after I practiced in a large hospital in Los Angeles as a rheumatologist for almost 26 years. So I hope you will spend some time with me to talk about what it means to be in a clinical trial. And I will talk to you a little bit about the history of clinical trials, the history of clinical research. We'll talk a little bit about the life cycle of a medication and how long it takes from the lab to the clinical trial, about what it means for you to potentially participate in a clinical trial, not only maybe some ideas that you have about what it means to be in a clinical trial, but what it takes and where you can find information about it. And then at the very end, I will open it up for a few questions if you may have any. So let's dive right in, and thanks again for participating at today's session. So let's talk about what is actually research. Well, research is a process of systemic inquiry, collection of data, and analysis and interpretation of data. Now, that sounds like a whole mouthful of things, but basically it means that we are looking at information that we gather with your help, and typically about a treatment, and typically today about a treatment for lupus, and what the results of these studies may be in terms of analysis and how to interpret the outcome. So you may ask, why do we even need medical research? We have so many treatments available. Well, I can tell you that out of the 30,000 known diseases to man today, we can really only treat about a third. So 10 out of 30,000 are treatable, but over 20,000 diseases have not yet found a good treatment, let alone a cure. So why do we need to do these clinical trials? Well, it's usually for us to advance our medical understanding of diseases, medical knowledge, and provide better treatments for you as lupus patients. And when a clinical trial starts, it takes a long time to collect all this evidence. On average, it takes about 5 to 7 years for a medication to go through its development cycle in clinical trials before it even is approved by a regulatory body and your doctor can prescribe it. So when we do clinical trials, we're really looking for the evidence that this medication works, but that's not it. We are looking for safety. So just because a drug works doesn't mean it's safe. And we need to look for quality. So does that medication really provide an improvement in the quality of life of patients like you? So that's why we do clinical trials today. So what happens to a clinical trial? Well, typically, again, a clinical trial is about testing of a new treatment to evaluate if it works and if it's safe. But clinical trials can do a lot more than just look at the treatment effect of a medication. We are looking for research methods. So what is the best and safest way to test a medication? What is the best way to prevent a disease instead of treat a disease? So for that, we need to do clinical trials as well. And then again, explore what is actually the best way where we can tell that you feel better. The story that I always told my patients before is that funny story that a patient comes back to the doctor after they started a clinical trial, and let's say they had arthritis in their joints, and at the beginning they had 40 joints swollen and painful, and they come back for the visit and come back with 26 joints swollen and painful, and the doctor says, "Oh, wow, you're down from 40 to 26 joints, you must feel so much better." And the patient looks at them like, I don't even notice a big difference at all. So this is what I'm talking about. So we really need to make sure that what we do has actually an important impact on the quality of life of a patient. So when we talk about clinical trials, there are a couple of different phases that you should learn about. We typically start what we call phase 1 before we go into a phase 2, 3, and then ultimately 4. Let me tell you and lead you through this, what it actually means. So when a medication comes out of the lab and maybe even of a preclinical study, we usually test this new medication first in healthy volunteers. Why do we do this? Because we don't want to risk the risk of a patient who has already a disease that something goes wrong. And we need to find out what is the right dose that we ultimately going to use in a patient. So that's why we do phase 1 studies. They're usually pretty small, maybe around somewhere as low as 10 to 100 patients. And what we basically do in this trial is we measure how this medication behaves in the blood. So how much medication goes into the bloodstream and what it does. Okay. Once we have passed that hurdle and we found out that the patient is safe and we have an idea of a dose, that's when we typically go into a phase 2. That's where you as patients come into the game. So let's say this is a medication for lupus. We'll then start testing it in a little bit of a bigger trial, usually 50, as big as 500 patients. Now we begin to look into how safe is it? We already did that before, but also does it really work for the disease that we intend to treat? Now, in many cases, we have studied the dose of this medication in healthy volunteers, but then find out, well, in lupus patients, that does not necessarily work so well. So we may have to adjust the dose. And that sets the stage for the next phase, which is called phase 3. The phase 3 study is ultimately the determining study that we need to do to find out, does this drug really work? What is the right dose? And is that medication ultimately approvable by the regulatory body like the Food and Drug Administration or the European Medical Agency? So these studies can become quite large and typically have several hundreds to sometimes thousands of patients in it. Now, if that study has been successful and the medication will come onto the market and your doctor can prescribe it for you, there's often another part, which we call phase 4. These are studies that we do to actually study long-term efficacy. A phase 3 study can sometimes last a year, maybe 2, but in the life of a lupus patient, as you well know, 2 years is nothing. So those phase 4 studies often look into long-term safety and what it does in real life, because study patients and patients that get it prescribed is not always the same thing. So these are the typical types of clinical trials, phase 1 to phase 4. Now, when I talk about clinical trials, you probably have this idea, you go to your doctor and you participate in this clinical trial, and then you have to see your doctor on a regular basis. That is true for most of the clinical trials that we do. That's what we call traditional clinical trials. But there is something that is called a decentralized clinical trial. What does that mean? Well, a decentralized clinical trial means that it may not always be necessary for you to go to your doctor every 4 weeks or every 2 weeks to participate in a clinical trial. We understand that this is often a burden on patients to come and drive, sometimes for many hours, and then you have problems with parking and stand in long lines to check in. So we would like to alleviate that burden from you in that you can do some visits from your home. Often we can do this with the help of a computer screen or with a cell phone, where you actually type in the information that we want to collect from you into a cell phone or a computer tablet. So why do we think about decentralized clinical trials? Well, I give you some numbers here on the bottom of the slide. So there are currently about 40,000 clinical trials in the United States are recruiting patients. That's not just for lupus, as you can imagine. That's across all the different diseases. But 80% of these studies, 80%, have problems being in time because it's not always easy to find patients. And the reasons why we have sometimes difficulties finding patients is we are looking for very particular patients like you, lupus patients. And you may not live in Los Angeles where the clinical trial is done, but 2 hours away. So that is a burden, and we try to work with you on alleviating that burden. Problem is also, you may be enthusiastic at the beginning and say, oh, wow, that's great. I want to participate in a clinical trial. But then after a year or so, it's like, oh, do I have to really drive this again? I'm feeling already better. So 85% of these trials fail to retain patients. So a lot of patients drop out. In fact, when you look across the board of all these clinical trials, about a third of all patients that participate in these trials drop out during the trial. So that's why we do decentralized clinical trials. Now, not every single trial that we do is decentralized. Often we talk about hybrid trials. And what that means is that some visits have to be done in your doctor's office and some visits can be done from your home. And this is how I spend my time when I talk to the pharma industry that wants to do a clinical trial in lupus. I tell them, are you sure you really need to do this every 4 weeks? Can we not do this every 8 weeks? And we do the 4-week visit from at home. And so that's what a decentralized clinical trial means. So let's just get back for a moment and talk about the history of clinical trials. I know some of you have probably heard about clinical trials and you have a lot of distrust in something. Oh, pharma experiments with me and I'm not sure what I'm getting into. And then there's this thing called the placebo, meaning, I don't even know what kind of medication I'm getting. And frankly, these concerns that you have are justifiable. There have been quite a few clinical trials in the past that were not done right. And they were not done, not only not right, but they were often done without the knowledge of the patients that got into these trials, what was actually done with them. A good example of them is the Tuskegee experiment in the 1930s, where black male patients were treated for syphilis, but didn't get really actual treatment. None of them were aware of what really happened. Then you probably heard about Contagan or thalidomide, which was a big deal in the 1960s or late 1950s, where babies were born with birth defects due to this medication. So some of the women were not aware, of course, that this is a potential side effect. And then, of course, during the Second World War, a lot of clinical trials were done in prisoners, and they were, not asked if they would even benefit. So based on this history and based on the fact that many things went wrong, the landscape of clinical trials nowadays is really very different. And it's the regulatory bodies all over the world are now very, very strict when it comes to what they call respect, beneficence, and justice. So nobody can go into clinical trials anymore and say, yeah, I'll just test something and, I don't have to tell the patient what I do. These times are long over. And there's the ICH GCP, which is a regulatory body that regulates this type of research worldwide. And let me just give you a couple of pointers how this actually looks like today. The United States National Institute of Health has a couple of guidelines that they are now requiring from pharma industry before they start a clinical trial. So here are a couple of important points. First question is, okay, so you want to do a clinical trial with a new medication. What's the value that you're going to bring to a patient? If a pharma company cannot answer, well, we really want to make the life of a patient better or significantly better, there's no start. Second question is, how is the science behind this? Does this really make sense? Have you tested that enough? And are you sure that this medication can potentially really help? If you don't have a good set of scientific data, maybe from animal models or from a scientific model that says that this drug may actually work, again, there's no path forward. Third point, fair patient selection. It's not that you can just go ahead and say, well, I only want to test it in females and only white females. It needs to be open to anyone. And anyone means if you're rich or poor, any color, and not just because it's convenient. Next point, favorable risk benefit. So again, you need to have a good rationale that this is actually going to help the patient. And we are not talking about marginal improvement. Yeah, it worked a little bit and good enough. No, there needs to be a really good reason to believe that this drug will make a difference. But more importantly is informed consent. Everybody that participates in a clinical trial nowadays needs to be informed what's actually going to happen with me. Okay, what are the questions? What do I have to do? What will happen to me during the clinical trial? What are my risks? And before that, you cannot really participate in a clinical trial. Independent review, that's another important thing, okay? In an independent clinical review, there must be a body that actually checks on the patient's welfare during the clinical trial. So not that this trial can go on and we have a lot of side effects and nobody pays attention. No, it's constantly being reviewed by an independent body of experts, typically doctors, and make sure that if there are a lot of side effects that happen during an early event, that you can be safe, and that somebody says, okay, wait, too many side effects here, we need to stop. And again, that's the respect, what we call for human subjects. So you are protected during and closely monitored during this trial, and that when something happens to you during this clinical trial, that you actually have access to clinical care in case you need to be admitted to a hospital or something like that. So these are the US National Institute of Health requirements before anybody can actually participate in a clinical trial. So let's switch gears for a moment and talk a little bit about the life cycle of a medication. And a lot of people may not really be aware of how long does it actually take for a lupus medication to see the light of the day, if it sees the light of the day. So when a chemist in the lab mixes some powders together and says, oh, I think I found a new lupus medication, and then ultimately tests it in a preclinical model, tissue cultures, or a mouse, that can take up to 6 years. So that's long before we do any clinical trials in any patients. Then, as I mentioned to you before, the clinical trial series starts, the phase 1 to the phase 3. That can add another 5 to 7 years to this development cycle. And then once this is all said and done and we have results of a clinical trial, that's when the FDA, so the Food and Drug Administration, looks at the file and says, oh, okay, so let us look over this and make sure that what you present to us here is really kosher and is really scientifically sound. That can take up to 2 years. So now when you add this all up, you can see how long it takes to even get to the market before a doctor can prescribe it. And then there is this phase 4 research that I mentioned to you. That's the post-approval stuff, because sometimes the regulatory bodies say to a drug company, okay, you have done a 1-year trial and you showed us that it works. That's great, but that's not enough for us. We want to see does it really work still after a year or 2 or 3. So you have to do some post-approval research in order to make sure, tell us and make sure that this actually doesn't stop working after a year, and you charge a lot of money for it. So when you look at this from a clinical perspective, out of 10,000 chemical agents, if you will, that want to grow up to become a lupus treatment, only actually 1 survives. 1 out of 10,000. Because somewhere along the way, either already in the preclinical stages or somewhere along the clinical trials that we do, we find out it worked really great in the mouse, and it had fantastic results in the mouse, but in humans, it did nothing. And you probably heard this about lupus medications. You know, they're very famous for that. They looked great in a laboratory, but when they were ultimately tested in lupus patients, they didn't really do very well. So let's talk about your role in participating in a clinical trial. The way I see it is you become a partner in a relationship that really has the pharma industry that develops this medication, the regulators that will watch over you, like the Food and Drug or the European Medical Agency, and us. Us is like what we call the contract research organization. We are the people who actually perform these clinical trials. We are the ones who ask you to participate, but you're going to be the center, and you dictate how this thing works and if it works, because without your passive participation, we can do nothing. So why is it important to participate in clinical trials? Well, It gives you an opportunity to contribute to medical research. So you can say, I was actually in that study that led to the approval of this important lupus medication that now helps thousands of lupus patients worldwide. You can help to discover better tests, better treatments, better outcome tools, and you can help yourself and others to improve quality of life. Sadly, there's also this blue circle that I have to mention, because that's, in my mind, should not really exist. But very often, and you probably know this better than I do, your doctor tells you, well, there's this really great medication for lupus, but your insurance company says, we can't really use it because it's so expensive. So some people participate in clinical trials because they know they get actually access to cutting-edge medications that they would otherwise not have access to. So if you look at the top 5 reasons why people choose to participate in clinical studies, it's actually quite interesting. I would have thought that people said, well, I want to feel better and I want to, get better with my disease. But interestingly, no. The majority of patients participate in clinical trials because they want to improve the lives of others or to advance medical knowledge. And only 15% out of those say, I'm going to participate because I want to improve my own condition. Now, granted, there are people that are professional patients, as we call them. They do this because they know they get paid for participation in a clinical trial and they want to make some extra money. Now, I'm not going to go into this topic, but generally it's not considered ethical to pay patients to participate in a clinical trial. So especially for patients with less means, it should not be that money is the reason why they participate in these clinical trials. And most of the trials are not allowed to offer actually money in order to coerce you to participate in a clinical trial. But some patients say that they like to see their doctor more often and they like to get more care because they know now, before that my doctor told me, I can only come every 3 months because they have not enough visits. Now they can come every 4 weeks or every 2 weeks. So that's enough incentive for them to participate. So let me have a quick word about minorities in clinical trials, because this has become a really important topic. Clinical trials have lacked diversity for many decades. 40% of Americans today belong to a racial or ethnic minority. But when you look at clinical trials, what's going on in the United States has nothing to do with what's going on in clinical trials. The majority of people in clinical trials are white. So here are a couple of examples on the bottom. African Americans and Blacks represent 13% of the population in the US, but only 7% participate in clinical trials. Similar data exist for Hispanic patients, 18% of the society in the US, but only 11% in clinical trials, and ultimately Asians, 6% of the US society, but only about 2% participate in clinical trials. So there is really a lack of diversity. Now, why is this important? Now, it's not just important that we are not really testing it in real life conditions, right? But it's also important because patients of different ethnicity and race respond to medications very differently. In fact, when you look at the history of lupus medications, there was, there was this medication called Benlysta that had ultimately more African Americans than they were required to enroll. But people also found out that the medication worked differently in white patients versus Black patients. So that's why it is important that we really need to compare the data in different ethnicities, because the medication may not work the same in different people. Now, there's obviously also a lot of distrust in these minorities, okay? Based on the history that I just told you, based on the fact that patients of minorities often have not the right access to rheumatologists or other subspecialists. Very often they don't have bilingual research staff that can translate and form consent to them, or that they understand it in their own language. And again, the socioeconomic status is often a limiting factor, meaning they have to work, they have to take care of children, and it may not have the time to invest into a clinical trial. So let's talk a little bit about if you're thinking about, well, maybe a clinical trial would be something for me. So the question is, how do you actually find out about these clinical trials? Well, interestingly, when you look at when we interviewed patients in clinical trials and we asked them, how did you hear about this clinical trial? You would think that they say, well, my doctor told me about this. But in fact, the majority of patients in clinical trials heard about this, about these studies from the internet. And today it may be one of these events because it's an internet event, right? And you hear about clinical trials. Unfortunately, I think it should be actually a rheumatologist's or your doctor's role to tell you about these, but unfortunately, that happens only in about 23% of all patients. The rest finds their information on the internet, TV, radio, newspapers, emails, or through ads, through social communities and patient advocacy groups like Lupus LA. So I want to give you an example about if you are sitting at home and thinking, okay, I want to find out more, how do I find this information? Now, it's not always easy to find this information. There is one clinical site on the internet that I want to tell you about today. That site is called clinicaltrials.gov, and I put a red circle on the top of the slide too, that you can see this. So clinicaltrials.gov is basically a website that lists all clinical trials for a particular disease. Now, I can tell you right away, it's not always easy to navigate if you are not familiar with it, but what I'm trying to do today is I show you how to navigate this site. So when I put this slide presentation together for you in December, I looked at the clinicaltrials.gov website, and worldwide, there were 176 studies for lupus that were actively recruiting patients. Now that you are pros in understanding what is a phase 1 to a phase 4, you can see on the right, there were 14 phase 1 studies, 38 phase 2 studies, and 25 phase 3 studies that you could participate in. Okay, so let me lead you through this. So how do I find out about a lupus study? So if you go into this website, clinicaltrials.gov, you type in under condition in that middle box, you just can type in lupus. That's all you need to do. And then it shows up lupus erythematosus or systemic lupus, and you can click on whatever you pick, lupus erythematosus. And then you click on the bottom that says search. You don't have to really do anything else, okay? So when you click on that search box, you will land on this site. Now, what you will see is a whole host of clinical trials, like hundreds of them, and like, oh my God, that's too complicated. And you will see all kinds of colors. But when you look on the left side here that says status, you will find a couple of subboxes, okay? And what these subboxes describe is, where do these clinical trials stand right now? Have they already been closed? Have they been completed? Are they still even active? Or are they recruiting patients? That's what you want to click, recruitment. Okay, so you click on that recruitment, and then you click on apply recruitment, and then you get actually all these clinical trials in lupus that are currently ongoing. And then you can click on each and every one of them, and you can learn about it. Number one, what's the medication? How is it given? Who are we looking for in terms of, what kind of lupus patient? Maybe some of these trials are only really looking at skin disease, others only looking at kidney disease. So if you have one of those, you can click on those. It tells you actually here under the location tab, where are these clinical trials done? Because you say, oh, that's something for me, but the clinical trial might be only in Europe or only in the US. But in the US, only on the East Coast. So you can learn about where is your next closest center where these studies are being done. And then you can contact that center if you want to participate. Now, ultimately, and we will do this very, very soon, you will also find some of the clinical trials that we are currently performing at Parexel on the Lupus LA website. So when you go to the Lupus LA website, there's a clinical tab or a little tab that says about clinical trials. And you will find these little boxes. There's currently, this trial is currently listed, and we will add about 5 more clinical trials to that list in the very near future. So stay tuned, and we will post that up very soon. And you can learn about, again, these clinical trials that are in your areas, and particularly, again, about the different mechanisms that we're currently studying for lupus patients. Okay, we are at the end of our journey. And I want to, before I leave, I want to give you 4 tips that can help you decide if you really want to participate in a clinical trial. First, it's important that you talk to your rheumatologist or your physician about participating, because they need to be on board. So talk to them and said, somebody talked to me about this clinical trial. What do you think? Okay. Ultimately, however, this will be your decision and should not be influenced by anyone. But if you're uncertain, bring a family member or a friend and discuss it with them. I read about this information. What do you think? Because these are your trusted advisors, and these are the people that you need to help you in the decision-making process and guide you along. Talk about it. Talk about to your church leaders, to your friends. If you have questions, talk about to your physicians, because I'm not clear what that means or what does it really take. So before you're not sure that this is really the right thing for you and you can actually invest the time to participate in a clinical trial, you should probably not do it. And last but not least, because I have done this with many, many patients during my clinical career, be honest and open. Because these clinical trials can be complicated. And if you don't understand it 100% what the clinical trial is really all about, you need to ask as many questions as you want. And, if you may even think these are totally stupid questions, there is no stupid question. Until you're really clear what it takes and what is required from you, you should not sign that informed consent. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention. And I wanted to open it up for maybe a question or two. Before I get into it, we will have a question and answer session coming up in the very near future as part of this seminar, where we will only dedicate the entire seminar to questions, but I thought I can take a couple of them today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Reiff. We do have some questions, and the first one is, are clinical trials usually free, and is the treatment free? What about the tests?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So clinical trials are always free, and the tests that are involved in these clinical trials, and they can be quite extensive. So we often talk about not just blood tests, but X-rays, MRIs, EKGs, you name it. They are part of the study, and they are coming at no cost to you.
Great, thank you so much. Another question we received is, are clinical trials safe for lupus patients if you're given placebo?
Yes, that's an excellent question. And I can tell you this is exactly what my job is at the Parexel company that I work for. Because, my clinical experience and having taken care of probably thousands of lupus patients in my career, I see myself as sort of a mediator between the pharma world and you as a patient. So when you look at the clinical trials in lupus, none of them are really performed as the placebo. Again, just for all of you who do not know what a placebo is, a placebo is basically a substance that looks like the medication, but does not contain an active ingredient. So, for example, if it's an infusion, the treatment contains the medication. The infusion, a placebo, is often just saline or glucose water without the active ingredient in it. So can it be safe for me to participate in something like this? That's always the key question, and really brings it down to the question of patient safety. Because the last thing that we want to do for you is to participate in a clinical trial, and then you have a flare, and then the whole thing starts all over again. So most of the clinical trials that are being performed in fragile diseases like lupus are performed on what we call a standard of care background. What that means is that the study medication is often added to the medication that you're currently taking. Now, if that study medication is very similar to a medication that you're already taken, like an infusion that has a similar mechanism or kind of same mechanism, then we will ask you to wash out, i.e. stop that medication before we give you the study medication. But you will always be on the medication that you came in with, like sometimes corticosteroids, the prednisone, or the hydroxychloroquine that you take, the Plaquenil, or medications for your blood pressure, or even your mycophenolate, whatever the medications are. It depends on the protocol, but very often we add the study medication onto your standard of care treatment in order to make it safe for you. That's a very good question.
Thank you so much. If you have time for just one more quick question.
Absolutely.
We had somebody ask, how long are clinical trials usually for lupus patients? Is there typically a time frame that?
Yes. So as you may remember, when I talked about the different phases of a clinical trial, phase 1 trials tend to be quite short. They're usually not longer than 6 months to about a year the most. If you're participating in a phase 2 trial, they can take a little longer. And in a phase 3 trial, sometimes even longer than that, so 2 or 3 years. Many patients always ask me, okay, let's say I participate in that phase 3 study, and after 2 years, the study ends and the medication worked really well for me. So what do I do then? And that is often a difficult question, because there is a delay where the drug has now been shown to work very well for lupus patients, but it's currently being reviewed by the regulatory bodies like the Food and Drug Administration, or EMA, and there's a little delay before it can actually be prescribed by your doctor. So what we do, me as a doctor at Parexel, we talk to the pharma companies and often say, please guarantee these patients that are in the clinical trial that they can stay on this medication until it's actually prescribable by your doctor, so that they don't fall in the hole because they really, they responded well to this treatment, but then they had to stop it because the clinical trial stopped. But unfortunately, that does not always work. And yes, it can indeed happen that even though you had a great response after several years, the drug may not be available for a while for you until it is prescribable by your doctor.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Reiff. We really appreciate you taking the time to answer our community's questions here today.
So thank you again, everyone, for attending the seminar, and I'm looking forward for, if you have time, to participate in the last session of the 3, in the question and answer session. So if you may have any other questions, I'm happy to respond to them at that time.
Great. Thank you so much.
Sure.